Make no mistake, what we're seeing across China is unprecedented. Not since the Tiananmen Square have there been such protests at such scale in so many widely dispersed locations. Will the communist government simply come down hard on these protesters, and would that be the end of the protest, or are these zero COVID norms unleashing a series of events which could become, in time to come, the biggest threat to the regime of Xi Jinping, who's just been given an extension to run China virtually for life? Joining me to talk about what's happening across China at this time is Victor Gao. He's the chair professor at the Suzhou University. He's been the former interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, understands the Chinese system very intimately. We've got Andrew K.P. Luing, China strategist and analyst, joining us from the Hong Kong University. We have Ben Cowling. He's the chair professor of epidemiology at the School of Public Health, University of Hong Kong. For an Indian perspective on what's happening across the border, we've got Brahma Chalani, one of India's leading strategic affairs experts, and Nitin Gokhale, national security analyst, author, joining us on this broadcast. I want to start by going across to Ben Cowling first. As somebody who studies epidemiology, give us your sense of the situation in China at this time. We'll come to the protests and the politics in just a moment, but here is a population that's relatively been kept away from the virus. Now we're seeing another surge, this at a time when the rest of the world, in countries like India, the United States, think COVID is now buried in the past. It's a reality that the people of China are having to deal with.
Well, that's right. China's done extremely well in the past almost 3 years in keeping COVID at bay with their zero COVID measures, their zero tolerance measures for any COVID outbreaks. But today they report 40,000 cases. It's the most they've reported. Going back a few months, there was a big outbreak in Shanghai. The outbreak now is across all provinces. Many different major cities are reporting thousands of daily cases, and it's proving very, very difficult to put the cork back in the bottle, to get case numbers back down to zero. And I think there's a lot of concern about how stringent the measures might need to get in order to achieve the government's aim of getting daily cases all the way back down to zero.
How do you see the virus progress, given what you know of the efficacy of the Chinese vaccination system, the reluctance, especially of the elderly, to get vaccinated, the manner in which the virus is spreading at this time, and the relative immunity the Chinese people have had so far, because the virus hasn't spread in China in the way that it did in countries like the US, Europe and in India?
Well, that's right. In China, they don't have any natural immunity because there's been very, very few infections in the past 3 years across the entire country. The vaccine coverage is pretty good with their inactivated vaccines, except for in their very elderly population, the very old and the very frail, and that's an issue. For now, though, I think the focus is still on stopping the outbreaks at the moment, getting the case numbers back down to a low level, rather than thinking about what might happen if there are more and more infections, because I think that would be a very serious challenge for their healthcare system, particularly given the low vaccine coverage in their elderly. And I think right now that they're still very, very focused on getting case numbers back down to zero with perhaps more stringent control measures.
Okay. Victor Gao, as somebody who understands the Chinese system and how this country's been run from the last several decades, the world outside hasn't seen these kind of protests. Students out on the streets defying the lockdown, asking for Xi to step down, calling the government and the Chinese system names. How worried are you by these protests that seem to be rocking different cities?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, protests of this scale happening in many cities is very rare in China. And I hope the Chinese government authorities will really look into this protest very seriously and sufficiently address the legitimate concerns expressed in the protests, and also deal with this COVID policy with greater flexibility. China used to achieve one goal, that is to minimize deaths and minimize infections for the Chinese people for the past 3 years. And I think China has made unprecedented success in this regard, as one of the panelists just now mentioned, and I fully agree. On the other hand, we also need to achieve another goal from now on, that is to bring life to normalcy and bring economic life and exchange between China and the rest of the world more or less back to normalcy. Now, how to transit from the former paradigm to the new paradigm is a challenge. And I think this transitional period involves a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risks, and I think China needs to really deal with this transition, on the one hand, very quickly, on the other hand, very prudently, and the goal is to minimize deaths and infections on the one hand, but also normalize life, normalize business activities, China, international exchanges. This is a tall order in any sense of the word, and I hope we will do a good job in going through this transitional period with less deaths, less infections, and greater success.
Can these protests pose a threat to the Chinese system? Remember, the USSR seemed very stable from the outside till all of a sudden it wasn't. And a lot of Western analysts have for the longest time raised questions about what happens behind that dark hole, saying that there isn't as much clarity about data about what's really going on as there is in other liberal democracies. And therefore, could these protests, are you at all concerned, unleash a series of events which raise a very serious question about the legitimacy of the Chinese system?
Allow me to emphasize, no country is as united as China is, especially after the successful conclusion of the 20th Party Congress. China has a clear vision about what it wants to achieve for the coming 5 years, what it wants to achieve by 2035, and what it wants to achieve by the middle of this century. And this is China in the real essence of the word. Now, protests express the different voices, etc., which contain legitimate points in asking for relaxation of the restrictions, of course. But on the other hand, some of the political voices they express are completely detached from the ground. I think the Chinese nation, in the overwhelming majority of our Chinese population, treasure the stability of the political system. We want to rally behind the government. We want to make sure that China will continue to rise economically, and this is the megatrend. I don't think these protests will disrupt this megatrend by any stretch of the imagination. Now, on the other hand, for a big country like China, protests should be considered normal. They should not really upturn the situation in any fundamental sense of the word. China is very strong, and China is not very fragile, for example, as some of the people may worry about. No, China is one of the strongest countries, most united in the world now.
So you say various things, and I want to build on the fact that you said that protests shouldn't really be a big deal, Brahmachalani. In most countries they aren't. The farmers' protests, the land acquisition protests in the United States are commonplace, as they should be. But those are countries where protests are common. In China, protests aren't common. That one guy unfurled one banner ahead of the Communist Party Congress, that itself created a flutter, and now here there are literally hundreds of people, young kids and older people, out on the roads. Is this just a normal protest to be dealt with no more seriously than you deal with any other protest in India, the US or elsewhere? Or do you think it's raising prickly questions that the mandarins in Beijing aren't used to answering to their public?
Participating in any protest in China takes much courage, as it comes with great personal risk. If you protest against the government and you raise slogans against the president like the current protesters are doing, then you're going to land up in jail. Many will just simply disappear. In fact, hundreds have already been arrested. And yet the protests are not only continuing, they're spreading. And they're spreading to new cities. The 1989 Beijing massacre at Tiananmen Square was concentrated in one city, in one area. But these protests are across large parts of China. So they are unprecedented, they are remarkable, and even though they may have begun in response to the harsh zero-COVID policies, the fact that the protesters are now chanting slogans like Xi Jinping, leave, leave, and Communist Party out clearly shows that what began as anger and frustration over zero COVID policies has become a popular uprising, and a popular uprising that is threatening to undermine one-party rule in China, and it holds major implications both for China and the world. And there are two ironies in this larger picture. The first irony is that China is the birthplace of the COVID pandemic, and now the surge of COVID cases is such that Guangzhou city in the south has just built a quarantine center for 250,000 people. That is the level of the surge in some cities and some areas. The second irony is that Xi Jinping's regime refuses to come clean on the virus's origins, and now protests at home over his COVID policies are undermining his image and standing. So we still do not know how the COVID virus began. Did it begin naturally as a spillover from wildlife, or was it triggered by the escape of a genetically engineered coronavirus from a lab in Wuhan? Wuhan is the center of Chinese research on superviruses. And Xi Jinping's regime has frustrated all efforts, including by the WHO, to conduct an independent forensic inquiry into the Wuhan labs. So given these double ironies, and given the fact that these protests are much bigger than just about COVID policies, it's clear that China today is at a watershed moment.
You're calling this a watershed moment? Slogans such as Xi Jinping down, down are certainly not slogans that you get to hear on the streets of China commonly. And therefore, Andrew Lewin, are you concerned that this could be the trigger of something much bigger? We've seen it in the Arab world where it starts small, the flare then becomes bigger and bigger, and suddenly it's uncontrollable.
No, I like to put things in their proper perspective. First of all, there is a great deal of misunderstanding of what so-called dynamic zero policy is all about. It's not to achieve absolute zero in all circumstances, in all places, at all times. It's only to ensure that there is the earliest possible detection, the earliest possible containment, the earliest possible prevention, and the earliest possible cure. The idea is not to achieve absolute zero number in all circumstances. And having said that, as recently as January 2022, at the beginning of this year, according to a world-renowned research company called Edelman Trust Barometer, based in New York, Edelman, you can Google that. According to their the survey in January 2022, surveying countries around the world and how people view the government's ability and also performance in response to the pandemic, China came up on top, supported by the vast majority of its people because of its ability to reduce the death numbers to the bare minimum. I mean, for example, the United States, we just suffered over 1 million deaths, and China's 4 times the population, and a much less advanced medical system. So you've got to compare like with like. And even in now, with the surge of the new variant, in Japan, for example, daily additional cases number something like 60,000, compared with only 30,000 in China, in spite of the fact that China has got 12 times more population compared with Japan, and of course, as I said, a much less advanced medical coverage, and with a lot of vulnerable groups. So having said that, though, I think that after 3 years, patience is beginning to wear thin. And of course, the young people in the various universities, they're now taking to the streets, and they seem to be spreading across the country. And then not only are they protesting against the lockdown, there are provocative slogans and also displaying white paper as a sign of protest, and banners and so on and so forth, and even calling the government to step down and even President Xi himself. So I think that this is a worrying trend, and because they are reminiscent of what appear to be color revolutions elsewhere. In fact,
do you think it could become that? That's the question I'm asking you. All these revolutions that we saw in the Arab world, which started out with matters not directly political, but became about something political, consumed the ruler of the day, there, at least from the outside, it seems there has been a build-up for some time. Is this literally where that outburst comes out into full public view?
No, I think that these kind of protests have a tendency to morph into something else. Speaking from Hong Kong, which I experienced the various protests before, I mean, they started off with something quite mundane, and then eventually evolved. And that's also what happened in the so-called color revolutions elsewhere. So I think that Beijing is likely to address this very seriously. But having said that, even a couple of months ago, Beijing has already introduced a special, more flexible mandate to the various provinces and cities, because not all cities are alike. Most of the Chinese population are concentrated in the big cities and in the coastal areas, and then a lot of vulnerable groups, the elderly, the vaccination rate is extremely low, something like only 40%. So I think that there is more flexibility given to the various provinces, and I think with the development of the pandemic becoming like an endemic, China is likely to wind down some of the restrictions, and even according to the recent estimate by Goldman Sachs, the restrictions are likely to be wound down in the beginning of next year, in the first part of next year, perhaps after the two sessions. But that was before all these protests happened, and as I said, there are worrying signs, political signs of these protests. But the President Xi's government, the Chinese Communist Party, still remains the party most supported by its people, according, for example, to the Harvard Kennedy School study last year, and the Elderman Trust study at the beginning of this year. So I think that these are only the signs of frustration expressed by the youngsters. And of course, the frustration is not just because of the pandemic. A lot of the young people tend to be lying flat these days because they see that the economy is loaded against them, controlled by some of the big boys. And that's why Beijing has advanced this strategy
so
of
Nitin Gokhale, now two things can happen. One, the state is strong enough to be able to accommodate such protests. These protests happen, the state loosens some of these restrictions, and then people get some air to breathe, they let loose some frustration, and things pipe down. That is the more optimistic scenario. The other is that the government hasn't responded rationally on COVID, may not respond rationally to these protests. They aren't used to people coming out in the protests and saying things like Xi down, down, and this could potentially become something much bigger, which again is something India would have to look at carefully, the Modi government would have to look at carefully, because it's happening right across our border.
Well, I think at the moment it seems it is completely internal to China's own problems, and the protests are seemingly unconnected at the moment, except for the common thread that the frustration of the people is coming out in smaller numbers at the moment, but there is potential for these numbers to swell. And this is unprecedented. This photograph, some photographs and some video footage that is coming out from there has not been seen in China for a generation now, or more, in 33 years after Tiananmen. And I think that is something that the Chinese authorities are not very familiar with, either the law enforcement authorities or the political leadership. And that's going to be a challenge, because I've always maintained that the Chinese are very good at set pieces. Since the Football World Cup is going on, let me give you an analogy, that they're good at taking penalty kicks or free kicks. But the moment the opponents start dribbling the ball, the authorities are at a loss how to deal or tackle these kind of tactics. Now that's where I think their greatest fear has been of the Chinese authorities, that the internal turmoil and the internal disturbances scare them the most. I recall an incident with a senior official in Tiananmen Square, in fact in 2009, when I asked her that why such a suffocating security detail here for the 60th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. The answer was very revealing. In fact, that time that man said, we are not afraid of any terrorist attack or any bomb blast taking place in Tiananmen Square. The security is very tight. But the fear is that if a Tibetan or a Uyghur person comes here and throws a pamphlet in protest against the repression in those areas, that is unacceptable to the leadership. Now that is the fragile nature of the Chinese leadership.
Ben Cowling, how should the administration be dealing with the current challenge? It's showing a hockey stick-like increase in the number of COVID cases. Potentially with some lag it will start showing up in death cases as well. They've also, because it's not just epidemiology here, it's also politics. They've put out this image of how the Chinese system was able to deal with the virus better than the Western system or the Indian system, Ben Cowling, and therefore now to belatedly acknowledge that a virus is a virus and it hits you in India as hard as it hits you in China is something which Xi Jinping, who in his mind and to his people is trying to show himself as the greatest leader and the greatest country. That's now very complicated, where politics is mixed in this cocktail with the virus.
Well, I think that's right. And your previous commentator said that dynamic zero COVID, fact, the expectation is not that it's going to be always at zero. That's correct. But the issue with dynamic zero COVID is that there's two kind of situations. One situation when you've got no cases in your community. That's great. Everything can go on as normal, businesses as normal, schools as normal, everything else. When there's an outbreak in your city, the city gets shut down, or certain districts of the city get shut down. Everybody's tested repeatedly. It's very disruptive, very costly, very troublesome. And a year ago, most of the country was at zero most of the time. But now, November 2022, unfortunately, most of the country has cases. Most cities are dealing with outbreaks, and there's a great economic cost to that, great social disruption to that. And I think that's where all the concerns are coming from. The dynamic zero COVID now is not working as well as it was working a year ago. And the question is what to do next. But there's no option for having a limited amount of COVID and not too many deaths and not too much societal disruption. Unfortunately, there are really only two ways that this is going to go. Either the lockdowns are going to get more stringent, like in Shanghai earlier this year, perhaps weeks or even months in some cities of lockdowns to get the case numbers back down to zero when the policies can be relaxed again. Or if the policies stay as they are now, not stringent enough to stop transmission, the case numbers are going to keep going up, creeping up initially, and then once the quarantine centers are full, like the one you mentioned in Guangzhou with 250,000 beds, once those facilities are full, the numbers will go up faster, and the epidemic will not stop until it runs out of steam, until a large number of people are infected. So that's the issue.
This also calls into question what Xi Jinping has been trying to project to the outside world and to his own people, that the Chinese system is somehow superior to the US, superior to India, superior to Europe. This virus is essentially telling Xi that the virus is the virus and you're all human in front of it, no matter whether you're in New York, Shanghai or New Delhi. And now he's in a tricky situation. What is he more likely to do? Clamp down on these protests further, like they attempted in Shanghai to take the case count down to zero, or eat some humble pie, let the virus run, acknowledge the fact that you made a mistake and that what you were saying for 3 years wasn't true, but that could then mean a massive lowering of esteem for Xi Jinping. He's in a very tricky situation.
Well, I don't think that it was a bad strategy. The error was in imagining that the strategy can be sustained in the long term without recognizing that viruses change. And unfortunately, COVID has changed. A year ago, before Omicron came to around the world, zero COVID was working pretty well. But the advent of Omicron, and particularly the latest versions of Omicron, it makes zero COVID very, very tough to sustain. And I think that that's the issue, that there wasn't a recognition that the virus could change. There was maybe some hubris in thinking that the government can always stop COVID, can always use all of these excellent measures and the infrastructure and so on. And unfortunately, right now, with case numbers increasing across China, it seems like it's going to be a big challenge to get case numbers back down to
Victor
zero.
Gao,
And
what's
if the case
Xi
numbers-
Jinping likely to do? Clamp down harder and further, or accept that he made a mistake and ease up on these zero COVID norms, even if it leads to a bigger surge in the number of COVID cases?
In all honesty,
unfortunately.
if you look at the protests and the Chinese government's response to this pandemic, I think there is only one enemy, and the enemy is the virus. So we need to be more scientific in understanding better this virus, its variants, and the different threats it poses for different, age
But this is
groups
what the
or
rest
age
of the world
groups.
has been saying for the longest time. I hate to say I told you so, but the rest of the world's been saying you have no option but to let the virus run through the community. That's how community immunity gets built, and ultimately that's the only thing that can save you. Every doctor in India was saying the same thing.
Allow me to emphasize one thing.
Yes, sir.
The rest of the world has already fully embraced the herd immunity on the condition that lots of people die and get massive amounts of infections. China doesn't want to acknowledge this is the only thing going forward. China up to today is doing whatever it can to refuse to accept herd immunity. China's policy is very different from any other country in the world, and philosophically speaking, I would say every country has its sovereign right to decide what they want to do in dealing with the pandemic. And China's policy up to today is the most successful policy by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at how many lives which have been saved, how many potential infections have been prevented. Now, we do not need to go into details. If you can single out any country in the world which has done what China has been doing in saving lives, preventing massive amount of infections, come on with your numbers. No one can match what China has achieved, and this is truly a miracle in mankind's history in dealing with the pandemic. Now, you talked about the herd immunity. Allow me to mention, China does not want to accept herd immunity. Up to today, China still is fine-tuning its dynamic zero policy in order to achieve two goals, that is, minimum infection, minimum deaths on the one hand, then less and less disruptions of daily life and economic activities. We believe we can achieve these goals in due course. For the protesters, allow me to remind all the protesters in China, they need to care about their personal safety, which is legitimate. They also need to care about China's social stability. We need to take care of both goals, rather than, for example, only allow my personal pursuit to trump the societal pursuit for the whole nation of 1.4 billion.
Brahmacharani, from what you know of Xi Jinping so far,
would agree with me, and they would support this very important policy.
is he likely to be practical as Chinese leaders have been in the past few decades and rule through pragmatism, or is he likely to double down because he simply cannot accept to admit to the world and to the people of China that he messed up for 3 years? What do you think is more likely, more restrictions or a more practical approach?
First, about Chinese numbers. About the Chinese numbers. If you trust Chinese numbers, then you might argue that China has been a success story in combating the COVID virus. But nobody trusts China's numbers, not even the Chinese people. But it's also important to keep in mind the fact that some wealthy states, some of the world's most highly vaccinated states, still are battling a surge of COVID. For example, the United States, it's averaging daily more than 40,000 cases. This is the 7-day average, more than 40,000 cases per day. And deaths in the US still are averaging more than 330 per day, looking at the 7-day average. So that's pretty high. And if you look at other countries like South Korea, Japan, number of European countries, several of these countries, the wealthy countries, the highly vaccinated countries, are battling COVID surges even today. So whatever is happening in China, we don't know the real figures there. The fact is that what China is facing today is quite a task for the government. But fortunately for the government, this virus like any other virus historically, as it has progressed, it has become less lethal, but more transmissible. Because it's more transmissible now, more people will easily pick up the infection. So zero COVID policy in the current situation is just impractical. It can never succeed. And in fact, in response to the protests, Xi Jinping's regime is going to ease the zero COVID policy, but he will not do it immediately because he will lose face.
No, but let's ask that question to Andrew Lewing, because one option is that Xi Jinping puts on his practical hat, says that people are frustrated, they're angry, they're out on the streets, the zero COVID policy is clearly not working, cases are going up, let's try and start easing some of these restrictions. The other is, if I were to do that, then the world would say I was wrong, and therefore there is no option but to double down. And therefore, like in Shanghai, elsewhere too, the restrictions become even more draconian, which could potentially make people even more furious. Which of the two is more likely in your view?
You're asking me?
Yes, sir, I am, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I said, China's COVID strategy has proved to be extremely successful, according to the New York-based Elderman Trust barometer, in comparison with all countries in the world. And it's great to the support from the Chinese people. But as I said, it's been 3 years and people's patience is beginning to wear thin. So it's not just a question of China having made any mistake in pushing the so-called zero COVID policy. As I pointed out right at the beginning, there's so much of misunderstanding about what zero COVID is all about. It's not achieve zero at all. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. By promoting immediate, earliest possible prevention, detection, treatment, and cure. But this has been extremely successful. Look at the end results. But I think what's likely to happen is that already happening, as I said, China's already handed down a more flexible kind of mandate to the various provinces. And of course, the pandemic has been mooring, as with the rest of the world, into likely to become an endemic, even though with this new variants. So be that as it may, even with some temporary researchers, I think it's quite likely that there will be a more flexible approach and more explanation of what the policy is about. But of course, above all, containing and addressing some of these protests, because they are more into something political, and then something which a lot of the young students do not really understand, or being taken advantage of.
Nitin Gokhale, the concern from India's perspective is very often in countries like China, to try and ensure that things domestically stay strong, they create an external national security worry that, okay, India is the enemy, or there's some problem there. So very often this is being done. To deal with your internal problems, create the specter of an external enemy. Is that something India would need to look out for, in your perspective, given the fact that the PLA is deployed as aggressively as it is across the LAC?
Well, certainly that cannot be ruled out, depending on what is the intensity of the protest internally. Remember, the Chinese leaders fear the most of the time is the loss of face. And here, if he admits now, and if it is proven that the virus wasn't, the antivirus vaccine wasn't effective, and neither were the measures to do zero COVID policy, then certainly to divert attention and to unify people, to try and attempt to unify people, will also be one of the factors in the calculation, which will be either Taiwan or India as the target. And certainly with 2.5 years of tension with India and the border incidents that are happening, or the massing of the troops on the border along the line of actual control, both in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, gives that option to Xi Jinping. But I think that would be the second step. First, I think there will be a hard crackdown on the people, and if that doesn't succeed, then maybe diversion will be attempted, either by launching some kind of an aggressive action against India or Taiwan. That is what I sort of look ahead and think.
The harsh reality is, for a virus, a human is a human. He's not Chinese, not American, he's not European, he's not Indian. and the virus attacks everybody's body equally, as the good doctor would tell us. Xi Jinping somehow tried to make it seem as if the Chinese system was dealing with the virus better in comparison with the rest of the world. These protests are raising very serious questions about those claims. Will he double down? Will he be practical? We will track that. But remember, as Nitin said, as these protests swell, the possibility of a national security diversion to get people's minds away from the virus is something that India would need to be awake to, as would Taiwan for that matter. I want to thank Andrew Lewing, Victor Gao, Ben Cowling, Nitin Gokhale and Brahmachalani for joining me on the Newstrack for this important conversation.